What's up, guys? Have you ever wondered about the role of the wrists in the ATP and WTA backhand? Well, let's dive in. It's going to be a very interesting biomechanical, anatomical discussion about how the wrists actually work on the modern pro backhand, both for men and women. We have Raducanu here, and I just want to try to work through some of the wrist positions and what the wrists are doing pre and at impact. And it can get confusing because we have two wrists involved here. We have the right wrist and the left wrist. And there's a little bit of anatomy and physiology here that you got to understand to try to understand what the wrists are actually doing. We'll also talk a little bit about the forearms. And the forearm has supination and pronation. The wrists have flexion and extension. And the wrists have ulnar deviation and radial deviation. So you got to try to understand those terms, and I will try to explain them to you as we go along here, so you can understand what the wrists are doing, because it's complicated. You have two wrists moving at once, and during the entire swing, and so it can get a little tricky trying to understand what wrist is doing. I will try to isolate each wrist so you can see what's going on. So here we have Raducanu, and this is what I wanted to talk about the most, is that I've been teaching a lot of kids, and they don't drop the wrist like this. You can see where the racket is. The racket is well below the ball. And if you look at the wrist position, what the wrists are doing, let's try to talk about ulnar deviation. So ulnar deviation is when the wrists drop to the pinky side. So both wrists here are ulnarly deviated. If you can look at where the wrists, what they're doing is the way the racket head drops is through ulnar deviation. Sometimes it's called ulnar flexion. But so it's important to understand that when you swing a two-handed backhand the modern way, the wrists have to drop like that. And most kids that I see, most adults that I see, they keep their wrists locked. So it's essential to let the wrist drop. And I'm going to show you numerous examples. We've got a lot of great pro footage here, both men and women coming up. We've got Djokovic, Nadal, many top female players like Coco. So you see Raducanu, she's got a larger WTA-style take-back. You can see the racket behind her back here. So the racket's on the back side of her body. She crosses the plane. Most of the men do not do that, but that's irrelevant related to the wrist action. The wrist action and forearm action is going to be the same, male or female, for the top ones. So as she's accelerating through here, look at the wrist positions here. She's fully ulnarly deviated. So both wrists are down, drop down. At the same time, and this can get confusing, her left wrist, if you can try to visualize or image, her left wrist is extended back, and that's the lag. So sometimes when you drop the racket, that's called the flip, like the racket goes from up high to low. So racket here is high, the wrists are up, and then the wrists are down as you accelerate. And then there's a reduction and the wrists sort of level out. So the left wrist is extended, and that's the lag. Extended, and the right wrist is flexed. But there's not active flexion or extension. This is all passive movement. The wrists are like a passenger in the car at the end of the kinetic chain here, at the end of the long levers of the arm. And the wrists are just passively moving through these actions. So don't try to do all this stuff with your wrists. There's not a lot of contraction going on in the wrists. There may be some eccentric control, but there's not a lot of concentric action of the wrists here, I would argue. And so you got to be aware of that. These wrists are the distal joints in the chain, and these joints have to be super relaxed so that the wrists can lag and flip. They can ulnarly deviate and extend and flex back. And to make the picture a little more complicated, there's also pronation, there's supination and pronation happening as well in the forearms. That's not a wrist movement, that's the forearm. So now I've got you all confused possibly. So don't swipe, I will explain as we move along. In terms of supination and pronation, the left wrist, now we're isolating the left wrist, is slightly supinating during the drop phase here, and then the left wrist starts to pronate more as you come through, and then eventually pronates even more typically as you follow through, just like on a forehand. And the right wrist is probably slightly goes through the opposite movements. Probably the right forearm, to use the correct anatomical term, is probably slightly pronated during this phase. And then that pronation sort of levels out or reduces. All right, let me show you a little better view from another pro, because this view hides some of the wrist action in the back there. But look at her loop, WTA style, large loop, kind of medium-sized loop around the body. So she builds up more momentum that way. It's a longer pathway, so Raducanu grabs more power that way. And then she has that complex wrist and forearm action through here. And if you notice, if you're interested in the other parts of her swing, she has a bent arm style here. You can see that both arms, there's a bent structure here, right, at impact. Both arms are bent. But she's not cramped up like a Swiatek or a Coco. So she's bent, but not, she's got a fairly good extension. I would call that a moderate bend, not an extreme bend like someone like Iga Swiatek, for example. It's a nice clean backhand, WTA style. Hands are a little high here. The racket's high. The racket's way above her head here. If you look, it's out of the screen. But it's a nice medium-sized loop, and she's got a great fluid action. There's all that complex wrist and forearm action there. So we'll get it right here. We'll get into this in a lot of clips. So stay tuned, please. Try to hang in there. We go through the science here, and pretty nice spacing here. It's reasonable spacing. She's not super cramped, and she's not super extended. Notice the quiet eye technique. The eyes are locked in. That's super, super big. We've talked a lot about the quiet eye technique, which is based on the scientific research of Joan Vickers, Vickers. You can look up her research in the literature, and she's done some incredible research on the importance of the quiet eye technique for concentration and focus and things like that, emotional control even. All right, so here we got Coco, and here you got a really nice shot of ulnar deviation. So let me take you through some of the terminology so you can try to figure it out. So here, if you look at the take back, the racket head is up. So everybody talks about that, right? The racket head is above the hands. You can see the hands here, and then you can see the racket above the hands. And what that is that's radial deviation. Both wrists are up to the pinky, up to the thumb side. So try to lock in that knowledge. Radial deviation, right here. Radial deviation, more or less. And then as the racket drops, which we all tell people, we got to drop the racket head to get topspin, right, to get under the ball. Now the wrists are an ulnar deviation. So this is radial. You can get a really good look at it here. To ulnar. And again, I would say this is probably a passive movement. Now, when you're teaching this, you might want to just have the player do this on kind of purposely, like consciously contract the muscles and let the racket head drop. Or you can try to get them to just passively let gravity be the driver of this wrist drop. But so ideally, this is a passive movement. The racket head is heavy and the racket head is dropping down, and it's using primarily gravity to execute the ulnar deviation. Right there. And this is where you can get really good topspin on a modern two-handed backhand because you get the racket head way below the ball. If you see where the racket head is here, I'll show you in the next clip. Look where the ball is. The ball's way up here. So you can see that this is going to be a nice topspin swing because of the way the racket head is dropped below the ball. So a lot of players don't do that. A lot of kids and adults don't do that. They don't let their wrist relax. So I have so many students who come to me who they may get this position, like they may get the racket head up position, and then they just lock their wrist and they swing straight through more or less from here, or they make a small C shape and they get a moderate amount of topspin, but they can never get a lot of topspin because they don't ulnarly deviate. They don't let the wrist relax and get this drop. So right here is where the racket flips. It's a little hard to see from this clip, but no, you can see the flip here, but this is where the racket starts to lag. So try to differentiate the flip where the racket head goes down below the wrist. That's the ulnar deviation from the lag. The lag is when the racket goes back that way. The racket lags behind and then builds up momentum and speed. And the lag movement, not to overwhelm you with wrist actions, but the lag movement is flexion in the right wrist and extension in the left wrist. So the right wrist is going to move into flexion, and the left wrist is going to move into extension. Wrist flexion, wrist extension. But each wrist is doing the opposite movement. So it gets a little confusing here. In terms of when you lag or when you take the racket back through these movements, what's happening with the forearm? The left forearm's likely going to a mild supination. So that's the left forearm there. And the right forearm is most likely going into a mild pronation, from not extreme pronation, but mild pronation. I've just worked with a student recently, and in this phase, I mean, look at the racket strings. The strings are facing us here, or the camera. If you look at the strings here, I see a lot of players who turn the strings to the ground here, and that would be essentially pronating the left forearm. You can try to follow me here. Pronating the left forearm. If you pronate the left forearm, you're going to get the strings facing the ground. And that would involve supinating the right forearm because it's opposite movements. So you don't want to close, you don't see pro backhands where they close the strings to the ground. So the strings are usually more facing the side. The strings may close ever so slightly to the ground, like a tilt, but and I'll show you that in some other videos too. But you don't want to, like a lot of kids, they try to get topspin by pronating their left forearm. That's this forearm here. This forearm here will pronate and the strings will face the ground. I can't even find any pros who do that. I'm sure there are a few who do, but that is not the most optimal way to get topspin. What you want to do is ulnarly deviate the wrist, and you want to keep your wrist, if anything, slightly, your left forearm slightly supinated. So that's complex. And the right forearm, the right wrist ulnarly deviates, and the right wrist and the right forearm probably slightly pronates. Remember, the lag is not about pronation or supination. The lag is not about ulnar deviation or radial deviation. The lag is about basically flexion and extension. And with the two-handed backhand, it's more complicated than a forehand because you have two wrists acting at once, two wrists acting on the lever of the racket. You have the left wrist, which is going from flexion, extension to flexion, and you have the right wrist going from flexion to extension. So you have all these fairly complicated. The movements themselves are not super complicated, but when you add them all up and you're trying to track what's happening, this is a complex, multiple wrist forearm movements in during the acceleration phase, which you can only see in slow motion video like we have here, fortunately, and then you can analyze it all. So as the wrists and the forearms come to the ball, you get a reduction in the wrists, the movement, the wrists become more neutral, essentially. The extreme ulnar deviation levels out and becomes more neutral. The extreme flexion in the right wrist becomes more neutral. You wouldn't want to hit the ball with extreme right wrist flexion. And the extreme extension in the left wrist becomes more neutral, moving more into flexion. I've got some great shots of this from some other pros, and I'll show you that. If you notice with Coco's swing, she tends to keep the racket more on the hitting side, for example, than Raducanu. So she has a kind of a combo ATP WTA backhand with the racket backswing more compact. And she's kind of a mystery. Sometimes she gets cramped up, like you can see how bent she is, the structure here. Very bent arms, more bent than Raducanu. And at other times, I've seen her extend more. So I think it depends on her positioning. And she has a world-class backhand, nevertheless. Like here, as you can see, she's kind of a little bit late and cramped. And her trunk's kind of at an odd angle. She's a little bit late. So, here's a good example of the wrist reducing. It's hard to see from that. Her body blocks the wrist, but the wrist here, the left wrist here is extended. The right wrist is flexed. And then as she swings through the ball, the left wrist comes into flexion and the right wrist moves into extension. So the terminology gets a little complicated. I apologize, but I really think nobody's really breaking this down anatomically on YouTube, so I wanted to share that with you guys, and then hopefully that knowledge will translate to on-court improvement. So here is another great backhand from Victoria Azarenka. So notice that here, guys, now that you know all the terminology, you're an expert, right, on this. You've got the racket head up. So if the racket head up, is the wrists are doing what? The wrists are in radial deviation. The thumb side, the racket's cocked up, corked up. And then as she accelerates, she wants to get below the ball to hit topspin. So now what do you see? You see extreme ulnar deviation in the wrists. Both wrists are ulnarly deviated. But try not to get lost because you also see extreme wrist flexion in the right wrist here. The right wrist is extremely flexed as well as ulnarly deviated. And the left wrist in the back there, I don't know if you can see that left wrist in the back is extremely extended and ulnarly deviated. So you have this combo deal in the wrists. You have when the racket drops below the ball like this, as during the acceleration phase, so she's pulling the racket through, the kinetic chain's at work, and the distal joints here of the wrists are passively moving through these actions. Not active contraction, not concentrically contracting, passively moving possibly with some eccentric control, right? Probably must have eccentric control so that the racket head you don't lose control of the racket head. But essentially, passive movement through these extreme ranges of motion. And when we're talking about the wrist, we're talking about wrist flexion. For the right wrist, you got to break down each wrist. The right wrist is an extreme flexion, an extreme ulnar deviation, and the left wrist back here is an extreme extension, an extreme ulnar deviation. Remember, the ulnar deviation is the racket head dropping down, flipping down to get spin and get under the ball. And when the right wrist goes into extreme flexion and the left wrist goes into extreme extension, that is the lag. And so you have this combo, lag and flip happening, that translates into the ATP or the modern backhand that's very whippy with the wrists. In terms of the forearm action, remember the forearm is pronation, supination. Most likely, from my view, the left forearm is slightly supinating and the right forearm is slightly pronating here, and then it flips around. The left wrist will go more into pronation. As she comes through, the left wrist will start to pronate more. Sorry, the left forearm. Pardon my terminology there. The left forearm and the right forearm will move from pronation a little more into supination, becoming more neutral. That's a reduction too. So those are the primary movements here. Applied biomechanics, understanding the anatomy is this is a little complex. You have two arms working, two joints working, multiple joints working, two wrists in action during acceleration. You guys with me? Did I lose any of you guys? Are you still? Did you swipe yet? Or are you still with me? Do you want to see some of the men? I got Alcaraz here. I just think there's so much confusion about what the wrists are actually doing, and there's a lot of junk out there in terms of instruction. So if you can understand clearly what each wrist and each forearm are doing, I think you really level up your knowledge as a coach or as a player if you're interested in the biomechanics and the technique. All right, here's Alcaraz. So where are the wrists now? The wrists are radially deviated. Thumb side up. The racket head is up. This is an interesting view from the back. It's a pretty good view to see what's happening with the wrists. You can see the lag really well here. So the wrists are dropping. So what's that? On the two-handed backhand, both wrists are moving into ulnar deviation. Both wrists here are ulnarly deviating. The racket head is heavy. It's dropping with gravity, and gravity is pushing the wrist down, pushing the racket down. It's a great shot of it here. I don't know if you can see, look closely, both wrists are dropping. And you can also see here the right wrist, the racket is lagging here. So when the racket lags, what's the right wrist doing? Extreme flexion. The right wrist, extreme flexion during the lag. And what's the left wrist doing during the lag? Extreme extension. And then all of that's going to reduce at impact. You couldn't stay like that. You'd break your wrist if you kept your wrist like that. So the energy of the kinetic chain, the physics of it, as you pull through, as you accelerate through from the kinetic chain, the racket tip comes around, the wrist level out in terms of flexion extension and in terms of ulnar deviation to radial deviation. And there's probably some mild forearm supination, pronation action happening there as we discussed. If you see with the men, what's interesting with the ATP style is look where the backswing is. So the backswing stays in the extreme on the chest side. The racket never crosses the plane of his body, whereas the women often take the extra loop here to get more momentum, more power. The men typically do not, in general. So that's a big difference between the ATP and WTA. It's the size of the backswing. Much more compact backswing, and this racket basically takes a vertical plunge here, and the racket doesn't loop around here. Dr. Brian Gordon calls that a hook loop. Like there's a little hook loop here. And I like the analogy of like the women come around here. It's kind of like stirring the soup action. They take this larger loop to get more momentum. Maybe they're not strong enough. You know, they don't have as powerful shoulders, upper bodies as the men. So that could play a factor. Although you could possibly condition the women to hit it like the men. And some women do. But you look at the wrist action, it's unbelievable. Like it's extreme. You have to teach this to kids and adults, or else they'll never try it. You have to show them on the court. I'll show kids this movement to get them to ulnarly deviate and to get them to feel the lag. Remember, the ulnar deviation is the flip, and the lag is the flexion extension. The other thing I would add is many players are tight in their wrists. If they have tight flexors and extensors, if they have tight ulnar deviators and ulnar flexors, for example, like those muscles will affect the amount of flip and the amount of lag. So I think it's very important to stretch these muscles, to stretch the radial deviators, for example, to stretch the flexors and extensors. Good wrist mobility program is critical for the modern two-handed backhand, and I don't see that being talked about very much. So here you have the flip, and the flip is, remember, ulnar deviation. Racket head drops down. Then you have this big lag, which is which is flexion and extension, and then you have a reduction to impact due to the forces of the kinetic chain. Alcaraz has a beautiful backhand, very compact chest side backhand, ATP structure. There's that entire movement there, as we described anatomically. Up, down, lag, acceleration through. All right, here's Halep, and here's a great example side by side. Does she come straight down like Alcaraz, ATP style? She does not, and you'll see where her racket goes around her body. Look at the difference. She takes the racket back behind, so backside, and then she comes through. So that's a major difference between WTA and ATP backhand in terms of the compact nature. ATP backhand is typically on the chest side of the body, so that would be this side of the body, and WTA backhands typically come to the back side of the body. Many female players do that, most likely to build up more power, to generate more momentum, more racket head speed. Nevertheless, the wrist action and the forearm action is the same. It's identical. So whether you take a big loop or whether you have a small hook loop, the wrist action is identical. Watch this. The racket head is up. So when the racket head is up, what is that movement of the wrist? That's radial deviation. Racket head corked or cocked up. As the racket head drops for topspin, the wrists go into extreme ulnar deviation. You can see both wrists here in ulnar deviation. This is a good shot of the forearm. The left forearm is supinated. And as she swings through, that forearm will start to pronate a bit. You can see that there. So you're going from supination to pronation there. And the right forearm will do the opposite. Right forearm be slightly pronated, and the right forearm will reduce to neutral, slightly supinated. So that's kind of the forearms at work. There's a lot of things at play here. That's why it's so hard for people to analyze. You have a lot of YouTube analysts who are, there's some good channels out there, some good analysis, but a lot of coaches don't quite understand all of the anatomy at work. And it's complex because there's you have two hands on the racket, two wrists working, two forearms working. It's complex and it's happening very, very quickly. You have to really slow it down to kind of dig into it. So I just think there's a lot of misinformation out there. Look how extreme this racket drop is. This is extreme ulnar deviation in both wrists. And look at the right wrist. What's that wrist doing here during the acceleration here? The right wrist is super duper flexed. Extreme flexion there, and that is part of the lag action. And the left wrist is extreme extension. And then those will all flip around, those will reduce. At impact, if she hit the ball with her right wrist like that, she'd probably break her wrist. Look at her right wrist. Extreme ulnar deviation and wrist flexion. Extreme. And the left wrist is extreme extension and ulnar deviation. And then watch how quickly the wrists reduce here in angle so she can strike the ball square. And now the wrists have evened out. And she's got pretty good extension here. She has a nice fluid backhand. So that is a really good example of the wrist actions and also the forearm actions there. Notice she has that high take back, kind of like a Zverev, hands pretty high. A lot of women like this style. This reminds me of Rybakina too, I have a clip of Rybakina coming up. The racket head's vertical, racket head's pretty high, and she generates a lot of momentum with the bigger loop. Not all players do that. The men a lot of times have the racket head maybe off to the side here, not straight vertical like that. Zverev does like this style. This is kind of like this. Some people like the backhand like that. I think it's I like it a little better when it's kind of compact, kind of like maybe Alcaraz, Rublev. But these are all very good backhands. Awesome world-class backhands. You can see there's some room for different stylistic elements here. She's very high, but when she returns serve, she doesn't take the racket this high. When she returns serve, she keeps the racket here more compact. All right, here's one of the greatest backhands of all time. I have Djokovic here. What do you see here? When the racket head's up, so what's the wrist action here? This is wrist radial deviation. Remember, the racket head's up, the wrists are radially deviated. Thumb side flexion. Radial deviation. As the racket head drops, so Djokovic is mostly chest side, his beautiful ATP backhand. So the racket's going to stay on the hitting side of his body, the chest side of his body. He's not going to take, sometimes he stirs the soup a little bit, like sometimes he'll come around a little bit, but primarily the racket's going to go here, down, and through, and he's not going to, you're never going to see him take the racket like over here somewhere behind his body. The racket's going to stay on that. That's typical of the ATP backhand. Look how the racket stays in that slot there. There. Never over here. Never behind his head, like behind his back, like Halep and many other female players. We looked at Raducanu in the beginning. She's back here somewhere with her racket, But so what are the wrists doing now? This is a low ball. So what have the wrists done here? They've gone from radial deviation here to ulnar deviation, extreme ulnar deviation. Again, the right wrist has extremely flexed and the left wrist has extended, and that's the lag. You got to stay loose in your wrist to get the flip and the lag. And those are the anatomical movements that explain or describe the action. Radial deviation, ulnar deviation. Right wrist flexed, left wrist extended. That's the combo action. And then as the racket head is accelerated through, this is passive movement of the wrist. The wrists level out. The right wrist goes in back to neutral from flexion, and the left wrist goes closer to neutral from extension. You can see that here. Racket head up, radial deviation. Racket head flips down right here. Remember, it's a low ball. Right here is, okay. The racket head, got it. You've got to get the racket head below the ball, especially on low balls, so you can swing upwards. And notice in all these examples, the racket head stays facing us. The racket face is towards us. That's one of the other notes that I wanted to make, technical notes, biomechanical notes. The strings face the camera. They don't face the ground. Notice as he's dropping this, as he's ulnarly deviating, the strings face, more or less us. There's a little bit of tilt to the ground here, but not much. I have a student I'm working with now, and she turns these strings to the ground. So what would that be? That would be pronation of the left forearm, rather than mild supination. So a lot of times you'll see that in juniors and adults. They'll try to get topspin not by ulnarly deviating. They'll try to get topspin by closing this racket face and pronating their left forearm. And remember, the right forearm's doing the opposite, so that would mean the right forearm is supinating. So the right forearm supinates, the left forearm pronates, and then the strings would be facing the ground here. If you watch a lot of players in slow motion, they do that mistake. It's probably a mistake. We don't see a lot of pros doing that. It could be an evolution, because we do see pronation when players hit an ATP forehand. You see players pronate their forearm and turn the strings to the back wall and turn their strings down to the ground. But interestingly, we don't tend to see that on the modern two-handed backhand. The strings tend to stay, basically the racket is kind of vertical or slightly tilted. And I think that's interesting, because you see a lot of pronation and a lot of turning of the racket strings to the back wall and to the ground on forehands, but you don't see that as much on backhands. So when I see it on the backhand, I usually try to fix it right now with my students. So I have a player now, she points right in this phase, the racket's pointing to the ground, and she's like super pronated with her left forearm, and then something about that biomechanically doesn't seem to be optimal, because you just don't see a lot of pros doing that, unless there'll be a new evolution that way. We have to keep our eyes out, see if the pros evolve that. But the two-handed backhands tend to be pretty clean with the racket face, and we haven't seen any extreme, like next gen, basically turning of the racket face to the ground or the back wall, as we do see with modern next gen forehands. Wanted to make that analysis. And Djokovic has just a beautiful classic pro backhand, ATP backhand. He tends to get a very straighter arm in the non-dominant arm, the left arm, which a lot of men do. And a lot of women tend to be more cramped at impact. He usually gets even a little more extended than here. He might have been a little close to the ball here. And remember, the right arm is always bent. The left arm gets extended on the men's ATP backhand. The right arm pulls through slightly bent. You can see that here. Elbows in flexion. And for men, the elbow tends to move into extension. Yeah, one of the most beautiful, clean backhands of all time. But you got to have this drop. See, most kids, they have the racket head up here, and then they just lock these wrists. The wrists just become locked, and they basically swing like straight through. and they never get the wrist squiggling. They never get the ulnar deviation, and they never get lag because they're locked. They're holding so much tension in the distal joints here that the racket can't. They don't even let the racket fall with gravity. They don't even let the racket do a gravity drop, and then the racket can never flip back as they're accelerating through because they hold too much tension all through here. So you got to work on that with players. Or if you're a player and you're having trouble getting topspin or racket head speed, you're going to have to learn to relax all the musculature in here. And that will allow some of this wrist action that we're all this complex movement that we're talking about. That will, if you relax the distal joints here, you will be able to have this drop, and you'll be able to have lag. And that's essentially the key to the modern two-handed backhand. It's not to stay locked. All right, so here's a great view of Nadal. What are the wrists doing now? This is really good slow motion footage. So the wrist here, is the racket head up or down? The racket head's up. So that's radial deviation. Thumb side movement of the wrist. You can see that in the left wrist, and you can see that in the right wrist here. Radial deviation. As he takes the racket back, you can see some slight, this is a great example of some very mild supination in the right forearm. Remember, the right forearm is going to go from supination, in this case he's lefty, the non-dominant arm, forearm, will go from supination to pronation. So as he swings through, if you watch that forearm, remember the forearms do the pronating and supinating. The forearm will go from mild supination to pronation. And it's the opposite for the dominant forearm, pronation to supination. And more importantly, probably for all of you folks, is the wrist action. What are the wrists doing? They're going from ulnar deviation, thumb side up. They're going to go pinky side down. Pinky side down is, they're going from radial deviation, thumb side up, to ulnar deviation, pinky side down. Radial deviation, ulnar deviation. Unbelievable ulnar deviation. Look at this. Look at the racket. This is the ulnar deviation, extreme drop of the racket head. Look how low this racket head is. Way below. This is going to be a huge topspin backhand. Incredible. Now, in this moment, when the wrist lags, you can see the lag here. So the racket flips down, and then the lag happens. Flips down, and then lag. And remember, the lag is flexion and extension. The back wrist, the non-dominant wrist, is extending, and the front wrist, the dominant wrist, is flexing big time. Unbelievable. Flexion and ulnar deviation. The racket head here is almost vertical, is almost straight down to the ground. Unbelievable. You see that here. And so he's going to come up to the ball, massive topspin on this backhand. This is the key to massive topspin. So the wrists reduce in angle, and they become more neutral to the impact here. Remember, impact was here. Where was the racket head? The racket head was down here. So you can see how vertical that swing is, but it's all coming from wrist ulnar deviation to get that topspin. And then a lot of the power is coming from the lag. You can call it a lag and snap, or you can call it a lag and whip. It's not an active snap, but it's lag and then whip through. But it's passive movement from the kinetic chain. So you can imagine how flexible his wrists have to be, how mobile his wrists have to be here to get this. Look at this. Wow. Now, for most people to try to do that, they probably injure themselves, but the pros typically don't get, there are a lot of orthopedic doctors, researchers who worry about this extreme ulnar deviation, but everybody does it. This is how you hit the modern two-handed backhand. So a lot of doctors worry about this movement, but I think you just have to strengthen the wrists and have mobile wrists to prevent injury rather than not doing what all the pros are doing nowadays. That's a good debate to have. Look at that. That's how everybody's hit. I'm going to show you Rybakina in a minute, and she does the same thing. She probably has the most extreme ulnar deviation. You'd think she'd get injured. I'll show you. But this is how pros do it. This is how you do it. You got to have strong wrists. You got to do a lot of injury prevention, and you got to have mobile wrists. Get this. Look at this. You guys see that? Unbelievable. I promise you, most of you do not get this position for topspin, and you do not get this this flip and this lag. And if the more you can mimic that, if you're flexible and mobile and strong enough, you can start hitting the pro backhand. One more time, looking at this, racket head is up. Racket head flips down as you starts to fire the, rotate the trunk and hips. Whoa. Way down. Full ulnar deviation and lag, and then up to the ball. Incredible. All right, here's Krykachova. This backhand is also very clean, nice backhand. Kind of has the high hand style. You can see that here. Watch the drop. Racket head up. Racket head drops. Here's the extreme ulnar deviation. Racket head's below the hands. The racket head went from high above the hands, very high above the hands, if you can see that, very high, which is you see in a typical WTA style. A lot of WTA players do that. Pretty clean drop here. It doesn't look like she takes the racket too far behind the body. Nice ulnar deviation here. So now the racket head is down below the hands. That's where you're going to get the topspin. So you got to teach this movement. You have to learn this movement. You have to learn to let the wrist go, to let the racket drop with gravity. Then she pulls it through. Typical WTA structure, bent arm, kind of like we saw with Coco. Very different from Djokovic, very different from Alcaraz, who are much straighter there. You can see the bent arm structure. But the wrist will reduce. There is lag. A little hard to see lag here, but there's definitely going to be lag here. The lag is indicated by the right wrist flexion and left wrist extension. Left wrist extension gives you the lag, right wrist flexion gives you the lag, and then those angles reduce. And you see the flip down coming from ulnar deviation in both wrists. Nice clean backhand. Again, I wanted to mention the strings face us. See how the racket face never closes to the ground. The racket face, it closes to the ground, slight tilt, but the racket face basically is towards us. And some players will turn these strings to the ground. And I think that's, arguably a mistake that should be fixed. The forearm should not, the left forearm should not pronate here. Look how the left forearm is neutral, or it becomes slightly supinated. Then it pronates during the acceleration to the ball and follow through. It's following the forearm action. Forearm action. Forearm action. Typically in follow-throughs, the forearm pronates on forehand and backhand. We're talking about the left one here. Beautiful backhand. Very high. Look at that. It's kind of like a Zverev style, Halep style. Very high. A lot of women like that. They like getting the hands up there. I don't know if that's as efficient as it could be, but, it works. Works very well. All right, here's Rybakina. This is the one I wanted to close with. The most extreme ulnar deviation I could find. I mean, if I was an orthopedic surgeon, I'd probably say you shouldn't do this. An orthopedic doctor, I think orthopedic doctors would say, this is crazy. If you look how twisted her wrists are here, extreme ulnar deviation. She must be hypermobile. Extreme ulnar deviation in both wrists, extreme flexion in the right wrist there, extreme extension to get the lag of the left wrist there. Remember, these are passive movements driven by gravity and the kinetic chain. She's not actively she's not actively contracting to achieve these positions and then snapping her wrist through. Here, the classic WTA structure, both arms are slightly bent. And she reduces all those angles that she achieved here as she's accelerating through. She couldn't hit the ball like this. Imagine if she hit the ball like this, she'd break her wrist. And as far as I know, Rybakina has not had any wrist injuries from playing. She broke her wrist once, but from falling, but she hasn't had any. She hasn't had to have surgery or any issues with her wrist. But it's unbelievable what happens with. I mean, this is probably the most extreme that I've seen. Maybe Nadal. We saw Nadal just earlier, similar. Show you another brief one here. So here the racket head is up. She likes the vertical style. Like I mentioned, a lot of female players like this vertical style. And the wrists are radially deviated. In this position, racket head's up. Get the racket head above the hands. A lot of coaches say that. It's a good tip. Get the racket head above the hands. But the racket head can't stay there. You got to let the racket head drop with gravity. You can see another typical of a WTA style. She takes the racket behind her back. She crosses the plane. It's a medium-sized backswing. So the racket comes behind her body a little bit. And we notice, if you remember with Djokovic and Alcaraz, that racket will stay on the chest side of her body. So you see how the racket head is way up here? It's basically vertical here. Now watch, as she's accelerating, she starts to rotate her trunk and fire her legs. Well, she hasn't fired her legs quite yet. But as she starts to rotate her trunk, look what happens to the racket. It's way down. So she's gone from up to like huge racket drop to give her spin. And then she's got the racket lagging back to get power, to get to maximize the stretch shortening cycle in the wrists and the shoulders. Look at this. Look how twisted the wrists are here. She's completely twisted up, and then obviously she couldn't hit the ball like that. So the racket head is going to level out. The racket head's going to square up. The wrists are going to level out. Right there, you can see this triangle here, kind of like a power triangle there with her elbows. And so now the wrists have become more neutral, so she can hit the ball cleanly and firmly. But watch what happened before that. This is what a lot of people don't see, and a lot of people don't do. You have to have very flexible, mobile wrists to do this. Look at this drop. Drop and lag. Flip and lag. Incredible. It looks like she'd totally get injured doing that, right? But a lot of pros do this. It doesn't look like something you would want to teach. Like if I saw someone teaching that to my kid, I'd be like, "Are you sure that's safe?" Look at this. Here's a great shot at it. Racket head up, radial deviation, thumb side movement, thumb side up. Racket head down, pinky side down. Massive, 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 right there. Massive ulnar deviation. And this is what I've been arguing is we have to teach this to kids and adults. they have to be flexible, strong, and mobile, but we have to teach this if they want to have the most optimal biomechanics, the modern biomechanics of the two-handed backhand, this is how you do it. But we got to make sure the wrists are strong. You can see why orthopedic doctors are concerned about this. Look at the potential repetitive strain here. But if you have strong mobile wrists, good flexibility program, good wrist strengthening program, I think you're going to be okay. Remember, most kids and adults, they lock this. So right here, they lock. They lock it up through here, and they just swing basically like straight through the ball. They do not get this part. They do not get this part down here. They skip that part. And so they don't get much topspin, and they hit the ball very flat. They don't get as much lag either. Wow, unbelievable, right? And then there's also lag, and the lag, remember, is the wrist flexion. Look at this massive wrist flexion also. She's curling her wrist, massive wrist flexion in that wrist. And the opposite is happening with the non-dominant wrist, massive extension, and then those angles will reduce. If you notice here, the wrist is almost neutral. It was super, you can see super curled, that's flexion. And then almost, it's going to be neutral at impact here. So the wrist went from, the front wrist went from super flexion to neutral, reduction in the angle, passive movement. And the left wrist, it's extended and it becomes less extended. Looks like it's still extended back here. It's reducing as well. That left wrist is still maybe slightly extended, but it's definitely reducing an angle as compared to when it's lagging here. Remember, the back forearm goes from supination or mild supination to a lot of pronation through the swing, typically. So you got double wrist actions and you got forearm actions. All right, don't try this at home unless you have good mobility, good flexibility, and strong wrists. Start working on those wrist strengthening exercises in the gym, and make sure you're doing lots of stretching. And I highly recommend you put your students, if you're a coach or a player, put yourself or your students through a wrist mobility program if you're trying to achieve these types of positions on the court. If you're a recreational player or a junior, or be careful, but this is the way all the pros are doing it. Thank you, guys. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. We tried to dig deep into the wrist actions and the forearm actions. If you have any questions, I wouldn't be surprised. It's a little complex. Please let me know. Hope you enjoyed the deep dive, and I'll see you on the next program.